I'm recording this on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I came back from the rally downtown. It was so powerful and so inspiring and so joyous. And I'm feeling that sense of pride for Israel in the air around our city and around our building. I also just came from our preschool celebration with an Israeli shuk and all the different destinations in Israel that the kids are visiting. So it's really been a wonderful week, a complicated week, of course, having Yom HaZikaron leading right into Yom HaAtzmaut. I want to talk with you for a few moments about Hatikva, about our national anthem of Medinat Israel, of the State of Israel. And I've been looking at the original poem that Hatikva was based on. I wanted to share with you a little bit about that poem and specifically the differences between the original poem called Tikvatenu, Our Hope, and the song that became the national anthem of the State of Israel. The poem was written by Naftali Herz Imber, who lived in the late 19th century. He was from Galicia, which was part of the Austrian Empire at the time. And he was a writer, a poet. He lived in several places. Eventually he did move to Palestine and lived there for some time, eventually afterwards moving to London. But he wrote the poem Tikvatenu in 1878 before he had gone to live in the land of Israel. And the poem, which has 9 stanzas altogether, is filled with biblical imagery, biblical phrases. Remember, it was a time when the language, the Hebrew language, wasn't yet a developed modern language. And yet he put together a poem that flowed easily, that was accessible, and as well was deeply steeped in biblical language. In particular, Hatikva, the phrase Lo Avda Tikvatenu, comes from the book of Ezekiel and the prophecy of the dry bones, where it says there that the negative of it, Avda Tikvatenu, Nigzarnu Lanu, our hope is lost, we're cut off, we are devastated. And of course he said, Od Lo Avda Tikvatenu, our hope is not lost, our hope remains. The idea of the dry bones coming to life. This is a messianic vision of a future redemption, of a time when the people of Israel are again flourishing. So that's where the original poem came from. And I wanted to point out 2 particular differences between the poem and the song that was adapted from it and became our anthem. Specifically, I'm looking at the phrase Liot Am Chofshi Be'artzenu. This is the end of the anthem, of course. To be a free nation in our land, Eretz Zion V'Yerushalayim, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. The original by Imber read not Lihiot Am Chofshi Be'artzenu. It read Mishuv Le'eretz Avotenu, to return to the land of our ancestors. And then the next line, the final line, Eretz Zion V'Yerushalayim, was not there at all. It said to return to the land of our ancestors, Le'ir ba David Chana, to the city in which King David encamped or rested. So those are 2 very specific differences. Lihiot Am Chofshi was originally not to be a free nation, but was about returning to the land of our ancestors. And Eretz Zion V'Yerushalayim was originally not about Zion and Jerusalem, but specifically about the city of David. And I think in those changes, we can reflect a little bit about the way our feelings about the land of Israel and Medinat Israel, the State of Israel, have evolved in the time since the poem was written and in the time since we have the state, the modern state. The poem was really written in exile with a longing to return. And so Mishuv Le'eretz Avotenu, this phrase, to return to the land of our ancestors, was the longing, was the dream. But by the time we are in Israel, and this song becomes the anthem, it had already been recast, rewritten, to acknowledge that we are here. So what's left to be longed or ached for? Liot Am Chofshi, to reach a full state of freedom, of well-being, because we're here, we're in Israel. And yet we look around and we see the dream is not fully realized. We call Israel Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, the first growing, budding, flowering of our redemption. We see the redemption. We are in the land. We have an independent Jewish state. And yet, especially the last few weeks and months, we see that we haven't achieved yet the ideal of what that state is. And it's interesting to think about that phrase, Am Chofshi, a free state. It's also a modern idea, that modern longing for democracy and freedom, which is so reflected in the struggles that we're seeing in Israel, revolving around the questions around democratic process. And so being a free state is still something that we aspire to. To be fully realized, in the sense that the arguments around government are still very real, are still live. And then the other difference, Iyar ba David Chana, that also is a biblical reference. The reference to the city where David rested, where David encamped, refers to the book of Isaiah. And that's the way that Jerusalem is called, Ariel, Kiryat Chana David. This word Ariel is another word for Jerusalem, the city where David encamped. And the reference to David really is a reference to a messianic promise, the restoration of Malchut David, of the Davidic dynasty, which is something that we hold as a religious ideal. So it's really interesting that was stricken from the original poem, and it became something a little more neutral and a little more perhaps universal. Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim, is still a very Zionist ideal, a very deep attachment to the land and to Jerusalem, but dropping the Davidic dynasty makes it a little less religious per se, and a little bit more universal for all the Jews who would become part of that Zionistic dream. And I think that also speaks very much to this tension that we see playing out in Israel all the time, the question of how can we be a modern secular state and yet also a Jewish religious state, and how the different groups within Israel relate to the state in different ways. So Tikvatenu, the poem, becoming Hatikva, the anthem, reflected some of the conversations that were had in the early days of the state and are still very relevant today, as we look at what Israel faces. I think it's important to also note that Hatikva as a song became something very passionate and significant even before there was a state of Israel. And I know that there was a recording by the BBC of hundreds of survivors of Bergen-Belsen singing this song, singing Hatikva, at the time of the liberation of the camp, at a Kabbalat Shabbat service, just 5 days after the camp was liberated. This song of Hatikva, of hope, was very much in the hearts of the early Zionists before there was a state. And of course we know that just 3 years later, Hatikva was sung after the proclamation of the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14th, Hey Iyar, the 5th of Iyar, at the Tel Aviv Museum. And it was played by the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra afterwards. So this song is more than a song, is more than a poem, is even more than an anthem. It is about Hatikva, the hope. And I can tell you that today, seeing our preschoolers with their Israeli flags painted on their cheeks, seeing our youth and our elders marching proudly in streets of Montreal, waving their Israeli flags, seeing all of this in a very difficult time has given me quite a lot of hope that the Israel that we know is still strong, that the future is bright, and that each and every one of us has a place in Eretz Yisrael and in Medinat Yisrael. I wish you all a happy, belated Yom HaAtzmaut and a Shabbat Shalom.